Discussion on the conflict in Mali and stability in that part of Africa. French troops in Mali are continuing their advance into areas recently held by Islamist militants. The unrest began last year when the government of Mali was overthrown in a military coup. Separatist groups in the north began fighting for independence shortly after and gained control of a large part of the country. This is 2 hours.
On the Tuareg, when I get into it, we're just 15,000 feet.
That's our gig and go down, so you're the first real speaker.
Excuse me. Sorry. No problem. That's okay. Good afternoon. My name is Good afternoon. My name is Peter Fahm, and I'm the director of the Michael S. Ansari Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the chairman of the Atlantic Council, Senator Chuck Hagel, our president and CEO, Fred Kemp, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for this discussion on managing the crisis in Mali and the Sahel. Before introducing today's topic, permit me to say a word about the Council's Africa Center for the benefit of the audience, those who are new to us or those who are joining us for the first time via television or the internet. The Ansari Africa Center was established in September 2009 with the mission to help transform U.S. and European policy approaches to Africa by emphasizing the building of strong geopolitical partnerships with African states and strengthening economic growth and prosperity on the continent. The center seeks to engage and inform both policymakers and the general public of the strategic importance of Africa, both globally and for American and European interests in particular, a subject which obviously commitment you share with us by joining us today, of the strategic importance. We do this through programs and publications as well as a robust media presence. Within the context of the Atlantic Council's work to promote constructive U.S. leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the central role of the Atlantic community in meeting international challenges, the Africa Center supports and collaborates with public and private sectors in forging practical solutions to the challenges and opportunities in Africa. It's on that note of the practical solutions that we've put together this panel today. I'm very pleased to discuss these issues, the strategic importance of what is going on in Mali, specific importance for U.S. and European interests, as well as for the security and stability of the region and Africa as a whole, that we have a very distinguished panel, one that's uniquely qualified to discuss the topic at hand. And I thank my colleagues for agreeing to be with us today, some at more than a little inconvenience and sacrifice on their own part, so I'm very grateful for that. The biographies were distributed at the beginning of this panel, so I won't consume time reviewing it. I'll just make a few notes. First up, we'll have Lieutenant Colonel retired Rudolph Atala, who's now a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. Colonel Atala, before his retirement in 2009, served a number of years as Africa Counterterrorism Director in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He was also contemporaneously, for the last of those years, Country Director for Morocco and Tunisia. And earlier in his career, did quite a bit of work, which I think you'll see drawn out, up in northern Mali, including over 40 missions and trips among the Tuareg in that region. So knows the region quite well. I'm very delighted to have him on our team at the Ansari Africa Center, as well as a friend. I'm also delighted to have another old friend, Dr. Ricardo René Laramont, Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Binghamton University and Carnegie Corporation Scholar on Islam. Ricardo has been a good friend and colleague, and in the Department of Shameless Self-Promotion, I might mention that he and I are editing a book together on the North African revolutions. but delighted to have him as scholar of the region and also a friend, and our wives have become friends as well, so it's in the family, so to speak. And then finally, last but not least, Dr. Anwar Bukhar is Assistant Professor of Political Science at McDaniel College and non-resident Senior Fellow at the Middle East Program of the Carnegie Endowment, and author of quite a number of works, some quite prescient in their timing on Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and its effects in the Sahel. You have their biographical notes for fuller details. I would note one thing that's not in the biographical notes, and I can't resist mentioning, that while there are few discussions of the crisis in Mali and the Sahel going around Washington these days, this will be the only one where the panel of speakers includes individuals who've been to Mokhtar Belmokhtar's house, someone who has broken bread with Al-Ghabas Aghintala at his home, and so I think there's a level of granularity that that will be rather interesting, especially when we get into the discussion, and hopefully we'll find that familiarity doesn't breed contempt, but actually a respect for the realities. One final note I would add on this panel: while we'll propose some solutions and some ideas at the end, I think our chief mission is to perhaps emphasize how much is not known, how much needs to be known, how much is complex in all this. And if there's anything to be learned from the Malian crisis of the last year, and speaking for myself, I think we have to acknowledge a failure in political vision and a failure in intelligence. We went around and believed our own mantras, and by we, I mean the international community at large. A certain government entity in this town produced a report to Congress which actually declared, I quote, "Mali is a poster child." Another department cited Mali as an oasis and a model. All the same time, while the democratically elected government was declining in presiding over a state that declined in its corruption perceptions index by Transparency International, fell 30 places over the course of several years. Where there is smoke, there must be fire, or at least a spark or two. So without justifying unjustifiable coup d'etats or unconstitutional, extra-constitutional steps, one has to acknowledge that perhaps we've taken the eye off the larger picture in focusing some of our efforts. I think that's fruitful discussion for later. So without further ado, I'd really want to turn this over to the panel and the specialists, people who've been on the ground, and begin with Rudy Atala.
Thank you. Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm looking across, and I recognize a lot of faces. So bear with me in the beginning. I'm just going to start at the 50,000-foot level and kind of pare down a little bit. For those of you who are new to the topic, you might want to at least get the initial feel for what's going on in the region. When decolonialization took root in Africa in the 1950s, the people of the Sahara, mainly the Tuareg, were pushing for political autonomy, often sparking conflict. And so as we approach Mali's independence in 1960, the tensions were already there. By 1962, we see the beginning of the first rebellion, 1962 to 1964. Not all the Tuareg groups in the north were on board with the rebellion. With the help of France, the fledgling government of Bamako was able to crush the Tuareg uprising. In that process, a couple of things happened that still play out today. One interesting thing for those of you who are following the events in Mali, you have a guy named Iyad Aghali, who was the emir of Ansar ad-Din. During that time period, Iyad's father, who was from the Ifugas tribe of the Tuareg, had gone and joined Bamako, and in his trek going north to crush the Tuareg rebellion, members of the Idnan tribe killed the father. So till today, Iyad himself holds a grudge against Idnan, which make up the bulk of the MNLA's military fighting force. So you can see there are some tribal tensions already from the beginning. Agnajim's father was also killed during this rebellion, and he is the head of the MNLA's military section. So all these tribal tensions play out throughout the years. So bear that in mind. Between the 70s and 80s, what we see is, right before that, there was a migration of Tuareg throughout the region. Now, as some of you know, that the Tuareg are not only indigenous to Mali, but they're indigenous to five countries within the region. During the oil boom of the 70s and into 80s, what you see is many Tuareg migrating north, primarily into Algeria, which was producing oil, and into Libya. Many of them found jobs, and then during the oil crash, many of them returned back to their land of residence. Now we're looking for something to do. That kind of set the stage for the second rebellion, which took place in the 1990s. During the second rebellion, something very similar to what happened to last year occurred back then. We had a rebellion. At the same time, we had shortly after a coup that took place in Mali, and then there was a regime change. So in this cobbling together, the whole time that the Tuareg had grievances, and grievances were well before Mali's independence in the 1960s. Some of these grievances, and there are several, but just paring them down, one is discrimination from southern ethnic groups which governed Mali following independence. And these discriminations were, what's creating the tension today between North and South. And I normally say there's racism between North and South. There was a fear that land reform would threaten their privileged access to agriculture. When you live out in the Sahara area, you have to rely on capitals, whether it's Bamako in the south or whether it's the capitals up towards the Mediterranean side for, the basics of life, your flour, the things that allow you to exist in that harsh environment. And the third thing was there was concern that national elites would destroy Tuareg culture under the guise of modernization. The one thing with the Tuareg that I discovered is, they call themselves Kel Tamashek. It's the people of the Tamashek speaking language. Their recognition is their whole culture is in their language. And so what happened is after Mali's independence, we see a pattern over the years of forcing the children, the Tuareg children in the north to learn southern languages and pushing out the Tamashek language and culture, which is a no-no amongst the Tuareg in the north. So fast forward after the second rebellion, then we move into a period of temporary peace and stability. Now, Algeria had stepped in, and there was a brokered agreement. I won't go into the details of it, and we can bring this up into the discussions. And then we move forward to the years of 2006 to 2009, when there was a third rebellion. Again, all coming back to grievances that the Tuareg were never dealt with. What happens during 2006 to 2009? There was an interesting dynamic. It was right around the time when narco-trafficking was really starting to grow. Actually, narco-trafficking started to take solid root inside in Mali right around circa 2005. Prior to that, in around 2002, 2003, you also have GSPC, which later on became AQIM, entering also the northern part of Mali. So moving forward from 2006 to 2009, we see a third rebellion, and then so all these groups that were up there, GSPC and the narco-trafficking trade that was coming through now, starts to flourish in its own way because you have disaster going on. GSPC sided with the narco-traffickers were primarily Barabish Arabs. Some of them are from the Tlemcen region, but for the most part, you have about 35 different Barabish families. There are certain families that were deeply involved in narco-trafficking. Ulad Idris is one, Ulad Aish. Those are the types of families that were primarily in the narco-trafficking business, and they're a minority of the ethnic groups in the north. The Tuareg would raid these convoys of drugs going through, and so what we end up seeing is Barabish Arabs and GSPC kind of linking themselves together and having a unity against the Tuareg, who were, one, raiding the drug convoys, and two, the Tuareg also did not want GSPC in their area. In 2006, I believe it was the fall of 2006, the Tuareg actually rose up and tried to throw GSPC members out of there. They had 3 clashes with GSPC members. Mukhtar Mukhtar was one of them, and took heavy losses, which they remember until today. So towards the tail end of the rebellion, going to 2009, the rebellion was crushed, and it was a combination of militia forces, Mali military, a whole combination of outside influences, internal influences. So some of the actors that were involved in the third rebellion leave from there, and they actually enter into Libya. And one of them is Bahanga. Bahanga starts going in and out of Libya. And approaching 2011, there was an additional talk about we need to get our grievances settled. And all of a sudden, Libya starts to teeter and break down. And Bahanga saw the writing on the wall and thought, well, how do I take advantage of this? So he went and connected with several other Tuareg that were already conscripted into Gaddafi's military, primarily the desert units like Agnajim. And so convinced them that if Gaddafi falls, maybe we can take advantage of this, take some of the weapons. Now we're better equipped. We bring, well-trained individuals. We come back to Mali, and then we lay down the law and say we want our grievances dealt with. So in the process of this happening, in the summer of 2011, Bahanga dies in a mysterious car accident. I have never gotten the true answer whether he was actually killed or whether it was a real accident. But Agnajim had agreed, several Tuaregs had agreed, and so the Tuaregs get together and they meet in a place called Zakak, which is in the northern part of Mali, right in the Algerian border, and they started discussing all the things that went wrong in previous rebellions and how do we deal with our grievances. In those discussions, they said, well, there are several things that we didn't do in previous rebellions. Number one, we really didn't have good media press. We didn't know how to tell the world what we were doing. So they relied on the youth, the Tuareg youth that had studied in Europe and other places to kind of push forward on the media front. Then they got together and said, well, we weren't equipped, we weren't a cohesive group, we need to bring representation from not just the Tuareg, but we have Kuntas up here, we have Berabish up here, we have Peul. We need to bring them all together and make sure that they are part of our group. So after discussing all this, they formed the MNLA, and they begin sending envoys from the north back down to Bamako to tell President ATT that they had some grievances and they wanted to table them. And so this process goes on from September, October 2011 for 3.5 months. And the former president of Mali decides to drag his feet. And according to the Tuareg in the north, the way that it was explained to me is he dragged his feet, but he began sending troops to the north to prep himself to crush them for a potential fourth rebellion. While they were watching this whole time, they were well equipped. During this time period, as a side note, a guy named Iyad Aghali came back on the scene. He was part of the past rebellions and wanted to be part of this MNLA group, but they didn't like his beliefs were starting to become were a little bit more non-secular. But number two, during the third rebellion around circa 2007, he had flipped sides on them. He was on one side, he was with the rebellion, and then later on he went down to Bamako to support them to overthrow his brethren in the north. So they said, no, we don't want you part of the MNLA. So he goes, fine, I'll have my Ansar Din, put together Ansar Din, totally backed by AQIM. And then the fourth rebellion begins in January of 2012. Within 2.5 months, a combination of the MNLA, AQIM, Ansar Din take over northern Mali. Mali soldiers were pushed out of the region, and then what happens is the discussions begin between the MNLA and the Islamists, essentially AQIM with Iyad Aghali as the face of the Tuareg, discussing what they wanted to do with the North in terms of governance. MNLA didn't have a good handle on how to control this vast region. And so they were relying on these groups to figure it out. The whole time these groups were looking for a way to elbow the MNLA out. And they successfully did that in June of 2012. So the MNLA was sidelined to the two quadrants of the country down in towards Menaka. Some of them remained towards Kidal, and then they went towards the Lere area towards the west on the Mauritanian border. How are we doing on time? And so ever since, during this period of time, there was a lot of confusion essentially. You know, some people are saying MNLA are Islamist, others are saying no, they're not Islamist. So this confusion I still find it today, especially in discussions with people. What's really interesting is during the time when the Islamists elbowed the MNLA out of the region and took control, they tried to kill Bilal Ag-Sharif, the president of the MNLA. And luckily, he didn't die and survived that. But during this period, the Islamists were smart enough where they were actually using MNLA flags on some of their vehicles, and they would commit atrocities. And you know, later on, some of these things, I'm not saying that the MNLA was totally clean, but a lot of these things were blamed on the MNLA. What's interesting is I believe it was October of 2012, two videos were released, and they were done by Ansar ad-Din's media wing, showing the killings in Aglhook and showing the killings in Tessalit of Malian soldiers and how they took control. So they were actually taking responsibility for these two things that prior to that was blamed completely on the MNLA, saying the MNLA are the ones that massacred Mali soldiers in cold blood and did X, Y, and Z. So fast forward till today, what we have is a very complex situation in the North. We have the secular MNLA that wants to remain secular, and they have a bunch of grievances. When you discuss things with them, they say we have fairly good representation from various ethnic groups in the North. You know, for instance, the chief of the Kuntas is on the side of the chief of the Tuareg, together with all the elders, discussed several things. Recently, I think it was January 9, 8, 9, 10, 70 traditional chiefs met in Tinzawatan on the Algerian border to continue discussing and streamlining how they would operate in the North and remain secular and you know, make sure everybody was on board. So you have that. Then you have Ansar ad-Din, which is now become a little smaller, but Iyad remains at the helm. I would say Iyad Aghali is 100% AQIM. I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that he's not. Then you have Mujao. Mujao is an interesting group because Mujao is actually made up of some radical elements that are very much in the camp of AQIM, but the bulk of them are actually made up of narco traffickers. So your Badabish families that were involved in the narco trafficking or whatnot made up the bulk of Mujao, and they were financing it up to a point where the Salafis began to go out and burn cigarettes out in the, you know, in the streets and saying, no, 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 we're purists and everything. All of a sudden you start seeing these internal tensions that started to rise. And then I'm going to leave it at this one more point. So, and then, so you have Ansar, and then AQIM in the back end that's literally running the show and making sure things are moving forward. What we have today now is the French rapidly took over, and I think the French have done a good job so far. However, I think there are certain things where the French really are going to need help with, because I think the period that we're entering in is a long period of insurgency that will have to be discussed. I'll stop here so other folks can talk, I think, or...
Well, thank you, Rudy, and thank you for setting out that context, and turn now to Ricardo and ask him to pick up on that and then give us some background from his back.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter. I would like to, in my presentation, discuss 6 points. So let me give you a little outline now and then I'll elaborate them. The first point that I want to talk about is the consequences of the fall of the Gaddafi regime and what that means for the region. There's an article in this morning's Foreign Policy saying that what has transpired in Mali is not a consequence of what transpired in Libya, and I think that analysis is mistaken. Secondly, as part of point one, we need as analysts and academicians to recognize that there is an emerging arc of instability that begins in Libya, arcs down through Mali, has to this moment avoided Niger substantially, and also embraces northern Nigeria. So that examining this question, I think, needs to be understood from a regional perspective rather than a national perspective. The second point that I would like to discuss are the emerging resistance groups within Mali and how they are similar and how they are different, not only in terms of their political objectives, but also in terms of the ethnic divisions that exist among these three different groups, more specifically AQIM, Ansar al-Din, and Mujao, and in understanding these ethnic and political differences that will provide us with an opportunity to understand not only how these groups are different, but also whether, from a diplomatic perspective, there are opportunities to create schisms among these groups. The third point that I would like to address is the arrangement of military forces between the Malian army and these insurgent groups in terms of numbers and in terms of armaments. The fourth point that I would like to address is what it will take to reconstitute the Malian army, which would then play a role in reconstituting the Malian state, which is on the verge of becoming a failed state. The fifth point that I would like to address is the question of whether an insurgency would arise in Mali and whether there are variations with regard to the possibility of insurgency in Mali depending upon city and region. And last, I would like to address what the United States should contemplate with regard to its own actions in the region. So getting to point one, even before the U.S. government decided that it was going to participate in a NATO exercise to essentially dismantle the Gaddafi regime in Libya, I knew even as that decision was going to be taken that there would be consequences throughout the Sahel. The reason being is that Muammar Gaddafi provided a regime of stability in the Sahel that was provided by his provision of direct economic benefits to the region, not only in terms of investment, but also in terms of direct transfers of monies to imams in the region. It was also predictable that upon his demise, not only would those economic benefits be removed, but that Tuareg soldiers in his Islamic region would no longer be on the payroll. And no longer being in the payroll, they would then have to return to their countries of origin, primarily northern Mali and northern Niger, because they were no longer employed. And in the context of his demise, two very important arms depots were made available in Tripoli and Ajdabiya, and heavy armaments were looted from those depots and fell into the hands of those who would subsequently constitute Ansar al-Din as they move forward, and then connected with some secular resistance fighters in the north. So that was the first point. The second point that we need to examine is that in the context of what's transpired in Libya, we then have a resistance movement. And as my colleague Uda Fatala has explained, there has been resistance in northern Mali among the Tel Amashek, or otherwise known as the Tuareg, with regard to the government in Bamako that can be traced to the 1960s but has manifested itself from the 1960s right to the present time. Now, recognizing that there have been these resistance movements and there have been interventions and diplomatic interventions, particularly by the Algerian government, to recognize these irredentist groups or reconcile them with the government of Bamako, nevertheless, if one does field work in northern Mali or if one conducts surveys in northern Mali, it is clear that the people of northern Mali who belong to the Tamashek, their aspiration is for autonomy within the region. So as part of this discussion with regard to policy, one of the things that we have to recognize is that the immediate demand of the Tamashek is autonomy. And it is arguable that an autonomous relationship between the North, not independence, an autonomous relationship between the North and the South may be the modus operandi that will provide for some reconciliation between the North and the South, because the North is not economically viable by itself. The only source of income in the North is contraband, whether it's cocaine or whether it's cigarettes or whether it's the movement of laborers. So it's clear that we need to contemplate as part of this policy discussion when we think about the reconstitution of the Malian state, an autonomous relationship between the North and the South. But when we engage that question of autonomy intellectually, we are then confronted with a situation highly similar to what I call the Kurdistan-Turkey relationship. It's clear that the creation of autonomy for the Kurds in northern Iraq could play a role in providing greater social and political harmony in Iraq. However, the creation of that autonomous zone creates instability within Turkey. The creation of an autonomous zone for the Tamashek in Mali would lead to greater social cohesion and possibly the reconstitution of the Malian state. However, the accomplishment of that objective would be contested by the Algerians, who would see it as destabilizing Algeria itself. So analytically, when we think about autonomy for this region, we have to be concerned not only with the reconstitution of the Malian state, but we also have to think about how the Algerians would perceive that relationship. So this goes to what we need to be discussing as part of my presentation, but our discussion, which is, as we move forward, what productive relationship can we have with the Algerians, because they have the largest army in the region, they have the best intelligence networks in the region, and as the pivotal state in the region, they need to be engaged as we move forward. So that can be part of the roundtable later. So that addresses the question of autonomy, but even within that section, as Mr. Atala explained, there are three groups. There is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is arguably the smallest of the group, most linked to Algeria, most allied to the jihadist perspectives of the now deceased Osama bin Laden, and still committed, at least on paper, to establishing a Sharia state in Algeria and establishing some sort of control in Mali. They, however, are not the most important player in this scenario from a political point of view, although they may be significant from a military point of view. The most important player from a political point of view is Ansar al-Din. However, even within Ansar al-Din, it is important to recognize that there are both Islamist and non-Islamist components. So even when we think about the second after Iyad Ghali in Ansar al-Din, which is Al-Qahabas Agin Tallah, who has recently broken off from Ansar al-Din, we recognize that if we were to perceive Ansar al-Din purely as a jihadist organization, it would cause us to falsely comprehend what Ansar al-Din is, because it has internal conflicts within it. Now, Al-Qahabas Agin Tallah then becomes an important player because he is the most important descendant of the Ifoghas clan. And I've met him on several occasions, and although he's a pious Muslim, he is interested in a collaborative relationship with the government of Bamako, which then puts him in a difficult position because as leader of the clan, he wants what's best from the clan economically, but at the same time he has to deal with the radical elements within his own community in Kidal. So it's sort of an American politician who is confronted with various constituencies within his district. A pragmatic, let's say you're a Republican, a pragmatic conservative in the Tea Party, and he has to keep both of them happy. So it's important for us to comprehend that beyond the facile analyses that are generally provided in the media, there are internal divisions within Ansar al-Din. And you mentioned the question of Mujao being engaged in drug trafficking, which is one of the things that they do, but there's also an important ethnic dimension to Mujao. Mujao has greater participants who are of the Songhai or the Pol, and fewer who are from the elite Ifoghas clan. So Mujao not only may engage in narcotics trafficking, but they represent different ethnic constituencies within the Kel Tamashek. All right? So these are things that we need to comprehend to not falsely and facilely categorize these groups as being radical or being secular. These groups are composed of communities of people who are cousins, who hold different political positions. And as in any family in the United States that has Republicans and Democrats within it, they have to reconcile. You're still cousins at the end of the day. And we have to appreciate that complexity as we try to understand the situation. Now let me move to point 3, which is the question of the arrangement of forces. Now we get in the question of military analysis. Before the coup d'etat in Mali, the Malian government and police forces approximately numbered 7,300. In my conversations in the green room with Mr. Attallah before, or Colonel Attallah before this, he said that's now about 6,000. The Islamist forces are numbered at approximately 12,500, so that means they're basically outnumbered 2 to 1. So they're outnumbered, and the Malian government is outgunned. I've been in email communications with a soldier from the Malian army who fought in Kona, and he was on top of a pickup truck with a machine gun that wasn't even properly bolted on the pickup truck. So as he was fighting the Mujao at Kona, all of his comrades retreated, right, and left him alone. So he had to retreat as well. So we need to comprehend that they're outgunned and they're outmanned. If they're going into battle with a pickup truck that doesn't have a properly bolted machine gun, and they're facing forces that have arms that we're taking from the Ajdabiya and Tripoli arms depots, it's clear that this is not a fair fight. So that's the third point. So let me get to the fourth, fifth, and sixth points rather quickly. And I think you want to save the sixth point for the round table. So we'll talk about just the fourth and the fifth point, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Anwar. We need to think about how the Malian state and the Malian army are to be reconstituted. There isn't a Malian state right now. That endeavor is going to take a great deal of time. The United States policy community needs to determine whether it is in its interest for the Malian state to be reconstituted and for the Malian army to be reconstituted. If we accept that there is indeed an emerging arc of instability that is going from Libya into Mali into northern Nigeria, if we answer that in an affirmative, then it answers the question of whether we need to play a role in reconstituting the Malian state and reconstituting the Malian army. Then we have to determine what resources the United States can bring to bear to accomplish those objectives. I personally do not think that the U.S. Army should play a grand role in the reconstitution of the Malian army because we have had an ephemeral role in the region. The key peacekeeping institute in Bamako has been staffed by French and Canadians and West Africans for a very long period of time. It would seem to make more sense for us to provide support to those people already on the ground. And lastly, and I'll turn it over, it is clear that the quick French capture of Gao, Timbuktu, and Kidal means that the next phase of the struggle will begin, which is a question of insurgency. And then the next question after that is that if there is an insurgency, what would be the probability of success of that insurgency? I'm going to go out on the limb and I will say that at least from my estimation and my experience, the possibility of greatest insurgency is going to be in Kidal. Because it is in Kidal where Ansar al-Din has the greatest base of ethnic support. The middle ground for insurgency will be Timbuktu. Because in Timbuktu, Ansar al-Din does not have the support of the majority of the population, but it has the support of a significant minority of the population. And the possibility of insurgency will probably be least in Kidal, because that is the area where Ansar al-Din has the smallest base of social support. The last question of what the United States should do, we shall reserve to the last round of the discussions.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for that very clear and masterful outline. And I just want to clarify, I think you meant the least opportunity or likelihood of insurgency was Gao.
Gao. Did I misspeak?
Kidal, yeah.
No, it's Gao. The greatest in Kidal, the least in Gao.
Just for everyone to be clear. And now, last but certainly not least, turn it over to Anwar.
Great. Thanks, Peter, for having me. I was asked to address Algeria and the conflict in Mali, as well as the consequences of what's unfolding in Mali today. I think the whole hostage crisis in Algeria has demonstrated the limits of that country's approach to fighting violent extremism. Since the end of the 1990s, Algerians have wanted to give the impression that they have settled their Islamist problem. Yet, despite their hardline policy of eradication and co-optation through amnesty, the state failed to stamp out residual militancy within its own territory. In reality, Algeria has only succeeded in internationalizing its war with its disgruntled Islamists. The transformation of Algerian violent Islamist groups into a regional franchise for terror began over a decade ago when Algerian forces chased Islamist combatants out of Algeria and into Mali. By 2003, the Islamists had spread into Mali and other neighboring countries. So these violent Algerian extremists, they gradually embedded themselves into Malian society, patiently building and expanding a structure of family ties, social support, political relations, and economic exchange. They also established close links with Arab communities and also with the rebels of the Tuareg ethnic group, who are spread, as we know, across national borders. And they also established links with networks for smuggling fuel, drugs, and arms. So by the 2000s, they had successfully built a terrorist criminal, both, it's important, terrorist criminal sanctuary in northern Mali. And by June 2012, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, in collaboration with the armed Islamist forces of Ansar Deen and the movement for Tawheed and Jihad in West Africa, called Mujwa, which is a splinter offshoot of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they had complete control of Mali's north. So Algeria watched these developments with great concern, but its reaction was tepid. The resources it has applied to fighting AQIM outside its territory have not matched its capabilities. In Mali, Algeria had hoped to stay on the sidelines during the country's latest cycle of insurrections. It focused on securing its own borders and containing the terrorist threats within the confines of Mali, Niger, and Mauritania. So until the sudden French intervention in Mali, Algeria was attempting to negotiate a political solution to the conflict by nudging the armed actors with whom it has connections. Algiers, as we know, had been a perennial mediator of conflicts between Mali's government and the Malian Tuareg. Algeria itself has a Tuareg population. It's very, very small, though. So Algeria was especially focused on Ansar Deen. Ansar Deen does not seek the partition of Mali, but it wants the implementation of Sharia law as they see it and interpret it throughout the country. The group's leader, Ayad al-Ghali, withdrew from the negotiation process with Bamako on January 7, 2013. That put a stop to Algeria's efforts to secure a diplomatic solution to the conflict in Mali. So there have been encouraging signs that Algeria is progressively becoming more practical and pragmatic in its approach to the conflict in Mali. Algeria, as we know, opened its airspace to French military jet fighters, and it closed its southern border with Mali when the French intervention began. In fact, since the 2011 Libyan conflict to Algeria's east, the country has become slightly more responsive to problems on its periphery, east and south. It significantly beefed up its presence, true presence, on its eastern and southern flanks, and it increased the number of checkpoints and surveillance flights to track the movements of drug dealers, armed traders, and terrorists that could carry the conflict across a range of territories. Border crossings were also tightened and the transport of goods controlled and monitored. So in January, for example, January 2013, the prime ministers of Algeria, Libya, and Tunisia, they met in the western Libyan border town of Ghadames, where they agreed to form joint teams to better coordinate their security along their porous borders and to stem the flow of drugs, arms, and fuel. Because the interdiction of fuel is critical. It's crucial. Why? Because it allows militants mobility. In fact, for years now, senior European and American counterterrorism officials, they have complained that Algeria was not doing enough to monitor its southern border, that it was not doing enough to control the resources, especially fuel, Toyota parts, and charcoal, that help these varied armed groups flourish. So controlling the southern border with Mali is necessary to weaken Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb capabilities and to disrupt its logistics operations. In the current conflict, if AQIM and its allies are cut off from the amenities they get from Algeria, they will have difficulty prolonging their fight. So that's why it was not surprising to see French counterterrorism officials who only a few months ago, they complained and they suspected, if you talk to them, that Algeria played a double game in Mali. They started applauding its decision to close its borders. Hollande, President Hollande, vociferous defense of Algeria's deadly hostage raid, it stems from this necessity to enlist Algeria's help in controlling the border. The mission cannot succeed without the assistance of Algeria, period. Mm-hmm. And Hollande knows it. That's why you saw the French reaction differed from the British initially and the Americans as well. So the French, obviously, they fear, they have economic interests. That's why they intervened in northern Mali. They fear that the control of armed groups of Mali, it would threaten its economic interests, but also that it would destabilize their far more important allies in North Africa. That's the major concern in European capitals. It's about North Africa, the fear that the conflict would spill over there. This concern over trans-border militancy is exacerbated by the difficult democratic transitions in North Africa and by state fragility in West Africa. For example, in North Africa, the risks of contagion and spillover are real. Tunisia is fastly becoming a smuggling corridor for armed dealers between Libya and Mali. And there is huge concern within the Nahda government, I was there in interviews, that Tunisia is becoming, for now, a corridor for armed dealers. We have seen seizures of large arms caches are becoming frequent, as was the case on January 17, when Tunisian security forces, they arrested members of militant groups and they confiscated rocket-propelled grenades and Kalashnikov rifles. Tunisia, the problem is that it could become more than just a transit route, as Tunisians that are currently fighting alongside Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb in Mali, they return home, and there's that concern. Tunisians are very concerned also about French presence in Mali. Nahda members, especially their parliamentarians, they are concerned that Tunisia might, or that the war in Mali might become a potent recruitment for disgruntled Tunisian Islamists and hardcore Salafists. There's also genuine concern of backlash against countries that are supportive of the French incursion. So far, cross-border links between militants have been tenuous so far, based more on greed and criminality than ideology. But that could change. The fear today in Tunisia and in Morocco and elsewhere in North Africa is that jihadi gangsters, militant Salafists and rebels, they might join forces, destabilizing countries that are transitioning from authoritarian rule and that have very weak security institutions. Tunisian authorities today, they are struggling to reform their dysfunctional security services. They are struggling to develop the capacities of the police and gendarmes to counter the threats. Even countries with strong security forces, there is danger there. Morocco, for example, has been on high alert since the French intervention. We know that several Moroccans have joined armed groups in Mali, about 70 of them that are with Mujwa and other actors. The country is also worried about stability in the Western Sahara. So that's for North Africa. Then there is the issue, the problem of the spillover into West Africa, where countries are fragile. Mauritania, Niger, and the territory of the Tindouf camps in northwest Algeria. The roots of instability obviously are complex and they run deep in Mauritania and Niger, and we can talk more about those later on. But I was asked to address Mauritania, specifically in northwestern Africa. Mauritania is generally considered or is seen by the EU and France as the least problematic state of the Sahel. The numbers of youths recruited into Qaeda so far remains very small, and the attacks carried on Mauritanian soil, they lacked sophistication. Al-Qaeda's capabilities in Mauritania are extremely limited, and its affiliated networks are disorganized and weak today. The government's aggressive pursuit and imprisonment of violent extremists has temporarily disrupted the growth of this nascent militant movement. But Mauritania, like other countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and even Senegal, they're faced with the challenge of ensuring control over their borders. I mean, Mauritania, it shares a long border with Mali, 2,240 kilometers. That's even more than Algeria, which it shares 1,300 kilometers border with Mali. So border management plays a key role in countering all forms of smuggling and also, as I said, slipping of the fighters in northern Mali to Mauritania. So Mauritania has adopted an aggressive approach to fighting violent extremists, more so than its neighbors, definitely more so than Mali. For example, it has equipped its airports, 3 airports, with IT systems. It has installed passport readers. It has built 27 posts to control its borders with EU help, obviously, and it has trained hundreds of border police officers. The Mauritanian government has also undertaken several initiatives to combat extremism. In addition to the military component, they have also introduced new anti-terrorism legislation. Also, the government has tried to delegitimize the ideological justification for violent radicalism, and that's important. They have hired hundreds of imams to preach in the country's mosques, as well as they have engaged extremist prisoners in a dialogue with credible Islamist scholars and clerics. And I'll stop right here and I can delve more into it if you want.
Thank you very much, Anwar. I think we've set a good context. I think the takeaway is we face in Mali today, even in the wake of the successes of Operation Serval, a situation of extraordinary complexity historically, socially, ethnically, geopolitically across the region. And I'd like to invite my fellow panelists to now weigh in, perhaps, given this complexity, looking more forward than backward. In the last few weeks, we've had the drama here in Washington debate over what extent the U.S. should be engaged or involved in this, the opportuneness or lack thereof, the timing of the French operation and all those issues, and about refueling tankers and who's paying for the fuel within. Looking more forward, where do we go from here? What are some policy recommendations, prescriptions, or at least guideposts for a pathway forward? Start with Rudy and
Well, I'm not gonna. I'm no longer working in policy, so I obviously I can't make any policy decisions. But having said that, you know, some thoughts to consider. I frankly truly believe this is going to move into an insurgency war, and it's up to the Islamists to decide how they want to play this. One thing that happened with the French intervention that required actually some initial planning, but I don't think was factored in because the reaction was so quickly, is what I've watched is a pouring off of refugees into neighboring countries, Mauritania, Burkina, Niger. What I'm hearing from a lot of the refugee camps, especially on the Burkina side, is a whole bunch of Mujahs have blended into the populations in those refugee camps. There's no vetting whatsoever. This is going to create some issues. The other problem is just in these demographics, the relationships that they have regionally. Correctly, as Ricardo has said correctly, is, you know, the towns were taken over very quickly. If you go back and look from June all the way until present, when the French intervened, Islamists were busily digging holes and trenching and everything outside of the towns. I kept hearing over and over again from friends I have in Timbuktu, who would say the Islamists are 60, 70 kilometers north of Timbuktu, and they're digging a hole here and they're doing this. Obviously, they were preparing for something, and the discussions of an intervention force has been ongoing. So they knew eventually something was coming their way. They're well prepped. I think what we need to do is step in, and I'm sure it's happening, is help the French think about how to deal with an insurgency. The point is also, we can't leave this intervention force to its own devices, because anybody who's ever dealt with counterinsurgency, it's not easy, it's very complex, and what you have is, in these intervention forces, you have Nigerians. Nigerians have had a history, a not real good history, with the Tuareg in their own country. Same thing with the Chadians. Now you stick them into an intervention force, and then, God forbid, what you have is your first suicide bomber, and, you know, intervention force applies a heavy hand in response. What you're going to start doing is you're going to take these ethnic tensions that are already there, and you're going to polarize them even more. And that's going to play in a big way in the hands of the Islamists, who already have been doing the recruiting and the preparations and all these things that go on with it. So I think that's something that we need to address in the long term, is how do we take this problem set and then, you know, untangle it with the French, with the Germans, with the Brits, with everybody. The other thing is also the large footprint. You place a very large footprint in Niger, in Agadez or whatnot. That's also going to be a cause célèbre for the Islamists to react, especially if there's a heavy-handedness right at the onset, and these social tensions start to flare up. Now all of a sudden, with a Western presence in the region, it's going to become a polarizing place for Islamists from other parts of the world to intervene. I mean, I know some of you have, or probably all of you have followed that the minute the French intervened, all of a sudden you're seeing on YouTube messages coming in from radical elements in Syria, from AQAP, from Yemen. It's starting to happen. Interestingly enough, I found a tweet I found very interesting, and this was about a month and a half ago, that came from an individual in Indonesia that was praising what the Islamists were doing in Northern Mali, and saying that it would hope that there would be all the support that they need from their brethren around the world to progress. So this is already filtered like a cancer everywhere, and what you have is, it's a center of attention. It's a center of attention for jihadis in different parts of the world. So this is where the caution comes in, and I think this is where the French can really benefit from our assistance in thinking in the long-term presence there.
Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is just be aware. We need to be aware that there is indeed a new arc of instability that starts at Libya, embraces Tunisia based upon what you've just said, extends down into Mali, not necessarily has affected Niger yet in a significant way, and then connects to northern Nigeria. That's the first thing. You have to be aware of that. Second thing is not to panic. Then after not panicking, the question then becomes, well, what do you do? Well, the thing that you do is don't send the Marines and don't send the Army. Don't put them in there. Don't put boots on the ground. When you do that, as we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, it doesn't work out very well. And then what is it we can do? Well, we do things, some things really well. Aerial reconnaissance, internet reconnaissance, provision of aid, to people who traditionally have played roles in the region, for example, in case of Mali, the Canadians and others, in terms of rebuilding the Malian army. But there's specific tasks that we need to seriously engage as a country right now that we're not. First of all, in Mali, we have to help that government integrate the militias into a national army. There's not a national debate on that question, but it's an important one. In Tunisia, as you've just mentioned, right, the forces of order that supported the Ben Ali regime needed to go away, but they need to be reconstituted in such a way that they serve a democratic state. We need to engage that question if we determine that that's in our interest. We have a failed state in Mali. It is not the subject of a grand policy debate in this country because it seems too far away. But don't pay attention to the problem long enough and let's see what happens, right? It will be much less costly for us now to invest in a modest way to reconstitute the Malian state and reconstitute the Malian army than to let that country fall into complete disarray and then pay much more later on. I won't address Niger because it's presently stable, but it has ongoing systemic and endemic questions with poverty. And then, of course, if we're continuing with this arc, we have to then think about Nigeria, northern Nigeria. I mean, to drive from Kano to Niamey takes 2 days. To drive from Niamey to Gao takes 1 day, so that's 3 days. To drive from Gao to Kidal is another day. It's only 4 days of traveling. It is very, very important for us as analysts to stop thinking from national perspectives and start thinking from regional perspectives. That's the only way that we're going to comprehend the dynamics of the challenges that are in front of us. And we're not doing it. We need to do it, and I'm glad that Peter and the Atlantic Council are trying to think about this in a regional perspective. But until we do that now, when it's less costly, it's going to cost us more later. But again, no boots on the ground.
I think in an environment of political instability, organized crime, which we haven't talked a lot about, the focus of the international community must be on institutional capacity building and on strengthening regional cooperation. In Mali, the risks, I mean, I hear a lot talk about Tuareg, but the problem, this is not just a Tuareg problem. You cannot just rely on the Tuareg or the MNLA, the self-proclaimed representative of all ethnic groups in northern Mali. The Tuareg are only a minority, right? In Mali and a minority in northern Mali. So the Tuareg are only one component among many. So any inclusive political solution should include, yes, the Tuareg, right? MNLA, yes, but also other ethnic groups, whether it be the Berbish, whether it be the Songhai, which are the majority, obviously, whether it be the Pole or other ethnic actors. So it has to be all inclusive. That's crucial. It's not just the Tuareg. That's number one. Number two, the risk, there is what Rudy put nicely, the intercommunal tensions. This is exactly what Al-Qaeda and others are waiting for, because they're just waiting to strike, right, for the opportunity. They're just bidding their time. And there are risks in there, right? We know, based on prior rebellions, the behavior of the Malian forces, right? Especially with light-skinned Tuareg and Arabs, right? So that's number one. We know that African forces, especially the Chadians, which do not report obviously to the MISMA, they're by themselves, these are one of the most seasoned warriors, and the French obviously are relying very heavily on them, which is good, because it's it's the same climate as in northern Mali, so they're very effective. The problem is that their behavior again on the ground does not elicit much optimism, right? In terms of abuse of human rights, there is a huge risk that might happen. And as Rudy said again nicely, I mean, God forbid, just one suicide attack, or even the Chadians, they don't even need that. They are heavy-handed in their approach. Look at Nigeria, who is leading the MISMA. Their behavior also does not elicit much optimism, right? It's the heavy-handed approach of Nigerian forces that have fueled the insurgency in northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, right? There's little talk about it, right? But they're to blame too, and that's important. So intercommunal tensions, I guess that's the most thing to watch, and the French obviously cannot wash their hands of them. I mean, it's their responsibility because they are leading it, and they have to make sure that does not happen. And for the African force we're talking about, that's going to take 18 months to train, right? So the EU is just sending about 200 trainers mid-February, and they will start in March. And that's going to take 18 months. So that's a long-term process. So what can the US do? What can the EU do? The problem is that we have too many institutions, too many structures, and there is no interoperability. I mean, the EU is sending their own folks. The Americans, we know, they have sent their own trainers to Niger and Mali. But from what I hear from folks in there in the ground, they say that they don't work together. So that's something that needs to be looked into.
There's something that I forgot to mention,
Yes,
which your comment just provoked me to remember. I forgot to mention the important role of Algeria. Nothing is going to happen here without Algeria, right? Paul Kennedy at Yale University about 15 years ago wrote this really important article in Foreign Affairs called The Pivotal States, right? And he argued that in every region of the world there's a pivotal state. Unless you work with that pivotal state, then the ancillary states around that pivotal state won't function properly. And his argument was that in West Africa, Nigeria is the pivotal state. In East Africa, arguably Kenya and Uganda are the pivotal states. In South Africa, it's South Africa. But in Northern Africa, it's Algeria. Algeria has the most capable army. It has the most capable intelligence services in the region. So as part of this policy discussion, we keep mentioning the United States, we keep mentioning the European Union. We really need to mention Algeria. We need to have their participation as we move forward.
Just for Algeria, I mean, we know that the Algerians would not put boots on the ground. I mean, that we know. That's ruled out, period. That's not even, matter or subject to talk. I mean, the Americans are not even trying to get the Americans to put boots on the ground. What they have been asking them to do is, as I said, it's border interdiction. Because the fuel, Toyota parts and others that go into these armed actors, they come from Algeria. And that's the request number two. Number one. Number two, these guys are sitting on $200 billion. So there is an expectation that Algeria would contribute the most to that fund that is needed to rebuild or to build the economy in northern Mali. But no boots on the ground, Algeria. I think we're just kidding ourselves as we believe that's going to happen.
And I think Ricardo makes a good point about the necessity of engaging them. But I think in engaging them, we have to also be looking at it with very clear lenses. That there can be no solution without them. That's right. On the other hand, pursuing that engagement doesn't blind us to the fact that they've tried to have it both ways for a very long time, and that's a very old habit that's going to be very difficult for some of them to break. And so that's going to be, I think, the tension. Analogies are imperfect, but in many respects, if we end up in a counterinsurgency scenario, we have here, in a way, a Pakistan to Afghanistan, a country that's both part of the solution, but it also has elements that are part of the problem, and how we resolve that is going to be critical.
I would say there's one more element to the southern part of Algeria that we need to kind of keep in mind. For many years, the Algerians have actually allowed Tuareg from northern Mali to get an Algerian passport. All they had to do was ask for it. and there's a free flow of trade, licit or illicit, going through those borders. And what you have is some of the economies are essentially tied together. What you also have is the possibility, and I don't have a smoking gun, but obviously for years and years of looking at it, that there are members within, as you have corrupt cops anywhere in the world, you have members potentially of DRS on the Algerian side that are complicit in the narco trade. So now, as you're trying to put pressure to control this, you also are affecting something that's been around for a very long time that's going to, affect some of the players. Mukhtar Mukhtar is very smart in one sense because he's made a lot of money, but he's also built relationships in the areas. This is where it starts getting very complex. He's flush with money, he's got great connections, understands the tribal dynamics in the region, and can actually pay people to do stuff. So these are the types of complexities which makes it difficult essentially for Algeria not only to project but to actually handle in a way that's going to produce something in the long run. It's hard to control all these borders too. I mean, we have a border problem with Mexico, and with all our technologies and everything that we do, we still have, could you imagine in the Sahara where really there's not that much technology, not that much projection, now you're trying to control Algeria, Niger, and Mauritania all at the same time. That's going to be a difficult thing to do.
Let me raise another issue that I think has been raised and invite the panelists to address it. As I alluded to in my brief introduction, although one does not excuse or pardon extra-constitutional measures, much less military coups, the fact is the coup in Mali did not occur in a vacuum. All our wishful thinking and platitudes notwithstanding, there were profound problems of corruption, soldiers not being paid, better off working for the radicals or extremists, they pay better and more regularly. There was the question of involvement of regime officials in the drug trade. In fact, ironically, I think it's well known in Interpol and other law enforcement circles, senior officials who were involved as business partners with the people now labeled as Islamists and extremists because they were working together and everyone was making money and happy together in the drug trade. Point one. Point two, if we fall into a situation of insurgency, which, at least there's a very real danger of, we all know fighting a counterinsurgency, the key is political legitimacy. You can't win a counterinsurgency without political legitimacy. So how do we get the sequencing? How do we get back to that, which is somehow being somewhat forgotten, I think, not our discussion, but also, I think, in the emphasis on raising funds to support military operations, training, et cetera. How do we get the political track back on, if anyone wants to?
Oh, the fundamental problem that you have in Mali is you have a series of lower level military leaders who have decided to seize power and they are no longer interested in relinquishing it. But at the same time, they don't have the power to actually construct a state. So how can you move forward? The fundamental question would be the subordination of military officers to civilian officials. But you don't have a cohort of civilian officials who can rise. So to me, it seems to me that before we get to the question of elections and before we get to the question of whether there's civilian leaders who can rise to form a government, we somehow need to inform those who have engaged in the coup d'etat that they have to get out of business. You have to make up your mind one way or the other. You either get out of business or you form a state. They haven't gotten out of business and they can't form a state. It's not like Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1952 in Egypt, where you see, he seized the state and he formed a government. They've seized the state, but they can't form a government. You know, so it's a real practical complication for us, and I don't know how we solve that problem, Peter. I don't know how we solve that problem, Ruben. Do you have any insight?
Well, not truly how to solve the problem, but actually to also maybe spotlight a little bit of the complexities. When I was in Côte d'Ivoire in 2000, 2003, when the coup happened in 2002, I was talking to an Ivorian general. He said something really interesting as it relates to the Sahel plain, specifically Mali, Burkina, and Niger. He said, you know, when Côte d'Ivoire had a coup, you know, there was an artery that went from Abidjan, from the port, and it was like a spinal column that went through the middle of the country, all the way up north, and actually that spinal column fed those landlocked states that are up north. And so what happened is when the coup divided the country, all of a sudden this economic push that was going north and feeding these Sahelian states was now all of a sudden under strain. And so it took several years for this spinal column to shift over into Ghana. And while this was happening, this is where we start, you know, as you approach the 2004, 2005, this is where you start seeing narco-trafficking expand. This is where you start seeing this illicit trade really expanding in the region. So what you have is these landlocked countries that are starving for finances and these local governments were looking for ways to continue to make money. So correctly, what we have is an integration of certain members within those states that were involved in the illicit trade. And so when you look at the from 2006 to 2007, during that rebellion, you have individuals from the Mali military like Lamana Ould-Abdou, who was killed and assassinated in June 2009, or Colonel Maydu. Those are names that were common names that were working with the Arab militias in the narco traffic as they were moving north, and they were actually making money. These are the same guys that were involved in the negotiations for the hostage releases, and some of that money was filtering back down to Bamako, which makes there's a complexity in north-south relationship on a financial organized crime level, and today we see some of that continues to fester. Now you pile it on top of all the other issues, and it really makes it difficult on how you build Humpty Dumpty. And really going forward, I think we just need to get to a level where the government in Bamako is at least in a position to really negotiate with the North and find some equitable solution in the long run, but that needs to be followed by external money to actually make sure that we tie in those grievances and make the environment a little bit better so we don't get another bubble over.
Yeah, but to elaborate on what you said, the fundamental immediate problem is you have military officers who are insistent that they are in charge when they're not in charge.
Yeah, no,
and then you couple that to what you just said, in which you have government officials or military officials who are also engaged in contraband, whether it's narcotics or cigarettes or the others, so that coming up with a plan of action to fix the problem then becomes confounded, because you don't know who you can identify to move the state forward, but nonetheless the state has to be moved forward, the state has to be recreated, so that it is then empowered to negotiate with the with the Tuaregs. It's a confounding challenge.
If I may, I'm just going to go way out on a limb right now. Just food for thought. I don't have a smoking gun. I have just bits and pieces of this. When the Islamists moved south into Kona, it was very rapid, and it literally surprised a lot of people. But there are two pieces to this that we need to think about. I think, and again, I'm going out on a limb here, so there was some agreement between North and South, because as the Islamists were controlling the North, I was getting a lot of feedback from people in Timbuktu saying there were flights of folks from Bamako that were actually going up to Timbuktu. people from the Islamic High Council were up in Timbuktu having discussions with Iyad and his people. And then there was some collaboration. So all of a sudden now what you have is Islamists overnight now are moving through Kona, and they're going quickly down towards Mopti and then Bamako. There is a possibility that the Islamists in the north don't care about the secular MNLA, and the guys in the south don't care about the secular MNLA. There's a convincing of, hey, Sharia is not a big deal. You know, it's Mali, we're all good Muslims, so we just follow Sharia, but it's a win-win. We just don't like these secular guys on the side. We push them aside. We continue the trade north and south. Sharia is around. Business continues, no big deal. The French intervene very quickly, and that wrecks this whole plan. And so it's something to keep in mind, but from all the talking that was coming up from the north, the south was really deeply in deep discussions with the north, and primarily Iyad as the face of the guy from the north on this. And it's something to keep in mind, and this may play out as we go further in trying to put this new government together.
You're absolutely right. Just why Iyad decided to go south, there are different theories in there. The Algerians obviously were frustrated because this is the guy that they relied on negotiating a deal. But there are different theories out there. One says that probably that he did not secure guarantees for the day after. I mean, there is a political deal, but I don't think that there is proof that they were planning to go all the way to Bamako. We can only, you know, this is just a conjecture, I guess, at this stage. To go back to the points that you raised, Peter, especially the first one, what we have fragile states, but there are differences between them. There are states that are unwilling and incapable. It means unwilling to address the political grievances, unwilling to take on organized crime, and they are incapable. They don't have the military capability. And that's Mali for us. That was just the worst of all. But nevertheless, we continued, the United States and others, on dispensing foreign aid to a country that we knew its leadership was unwilling to act. Then you have countries that are willing but incapable, right? And these are the countries that needs assistance, because it's a matter of political will at the end. Incapability can be addressed, right? The military can be empowered. But if you don't have the political will to take on, obviously, organized crime, etc., that's an issue. We have unwilling, incapable. There are unwilling and capable, Mauritania. No, Mauritania is willing, to be fair. And there are no willing and capable at this stage. For the legitimacy issue, that's crucial, because there has to be a political solution to it. You're absolutely right. The problem is that the political elite in Mali is discredited. And what we will see when there is an election is that most of them are the same guys. They are known quantity, and they don't have much respect in the streets. Nevertheless, there has to be a timeline for elections. The interim president talks about July. The parliament met 2 days ago, and they agreed on a timeline that there might be election, though they haven't picked July as a date. As for the military, there is a window of opportunity. Senago has lost a lot of support since the coup, a lot of support. That's one. Number two, you've got the French now in Bamako, and they have the possibility to exert pressure to get the military out of business, what you said, Rika. So there is a window of opportunity right here in which you can empower the civilian institutions at the expense of the military. But unless there is a political solution, obviously we're not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add things. I really want to de-emphasize elections. You know, we in America are obsessed with elections. You know, elections are a waste of time. You know, I mean, unless you have a cohort of political leadership, what's the point of having an election? You needed a Jefferson and a Madison and a Washington. You needed a cohort of leadership before you have an election. What's the point of having an election? So some fool will get elected and nominally in charge, and he's not really leading a cohort. There's no sense of political coherence among the elite about what the state is going to be. I mean, look at Egypt. What's the point of having an election if you don't have elite coherence about what the future of the state is going to be? You have an election, you make things worse. Now, eventually you have an election, but the question is, when do you have an election? You clearly have an election after you have a certain degree of elite coherence about what the future articulation of the state is going to be. I think it would be disastrous to have an election in Mali until you have a cohort of civilian leaders who are united in articulating that there's going to be a Malian state. Would not counsel it. Doesn't make sense. You're just going to throw someone up there that, who are they leading? It's like having an army without troops. You know? You got to have a sense of elite coherence about what the state is going to be about, and it's not there yet. Mm-hmm. You have to think logically about these things. You know? So let's stop with the elections. Stop talking about elections. Elections are only valuable at a certain moment in time after you have a cohort of leaders who agree that there's going to be a state. You don't have that yet. You don't have that yet in Mali. That's my point of view anyway.
I'm sure that's going to provoke, when we go to questions, a number of questions, and I thank you for going out on a limb as well. Of course, one can always speculate if lack of elite coherence and not having elections. I guess I voted for the last time in D.C. and we'll suspend elections for a while here. Before we go to questions, I think another thing, elephant in the room, I think would be irresponsible of me to open things up without at least having a first brief comments from the panel. This week it was reported in the media on the agreement between the U.S. and Niger to establish a base for unmanned aerial vehicles in Niger for ISR purposes, at least initially. Any comments, reactions on that? Because I'm sure people are interested.
I mean, you always hear the same argument is if we set up ISR and then we shift from ISR to drone strikes and things don't go, we accidentally get the wrong group of folks, then again you highlight the folks and whether it's going to be Agadez or wherever they're going to put the place, it becomes a lightning rod for other folks to come into the area. Having said that, obviously you need an area to look at, because we're talking about a geographic space the size of the United States. So it's a very large, massive area to cover. I don't know if there's a right or wrong to this, but there are certain things that need to be factored in, and very quickly, too soon, if we don't think about this. Anybody who's been to Agadez, you get one American over there and everybody knows about it. It's not a big place, and so when you start talking about putting 200-300 on the ground, that's going to garner some attention.
Mm-hmm. I have nothing to add to that. That's
okay. Now go to questions. Invite because a reminder to the audience and those with questions that please this an opportunity for questions to give everyone a chance. Limit yourself to a question, and please identify yourself and wait for the microphones. And we'll start in the front row here, please. With microphone.
Ricardo correctly pointed to the fact that
Malik, could you identify yourself if you don't mind?
Malik Chaka, I work for Millennium Challenge Corporation. I'm speaking on my own behalf. He correctly made a connection between the demise of the Gaddafi regime and what's unfolded in Mali. Nobody went back and said that the chaos that presently obtains in Libya, does that have to be addressed to get the situation in Mali in hand? And if I could ask just a similar question, people pointed to the fact that if we look at that sub-region, that Niger appeared to be in somewhat better shape than other places, despite the fact it's a bad neighborhood. Is there any way that we could evolve a policy that would immunize Niger from getting infected with the same kind of disease that obtains in northern Nigeria or in northern Mali.
Thank you very much, Malik. And back there, Ni? Mike.
Thank you very much. Nia Kwete is my name. I'm an independent analyst here in Washington. The Mali problem is the most complex I have come across in over 40 years, so it's hard to deal with all of it now. There are things said that I think are right on the money. There are others which I disagree with, but I think one that has been left, the U.S. role, it's been talked about, but I think the first question is, why should the U.S. really care? Why should Americans care? I think that's the issue that hasn't been addressed. I will say that there are all kinds of reasons why the U.S. should care, from their involvement with the Army and Sanogo and others for 8 years, and the fact that, as Rene said, if it's not dealt with, it will come back and bite the U.S. So I would like the panelists to talk about, make the case to the U.S. why it should be involved, because I don't think that has been made enough.
I think it's incumbent on me. I know of at least, and forgive me if there are others I don't recognize, but there is one Malian in the room, and I think we owe it to him. So, yeah, wait for the microphone, please.
I would like to thank this incredible panel. I'm thrilled to hear the things that has been talked about today. I'm elected mayor in Mali. My name is Ye Samake of Wele Sebugu. Now, I'm a U.S. educated, but I returned back home. The question I would like to ask will be directed to Ricardo, even though it will be based on Peter's introduction, that Mali was a failed state, that the issue in Mali was a leadership issue, not an ethnic or religious issue, but primarily a leadership issue. And I thank you for truly addressing that. Now, you talk about leadership in Mali, that why should we organize elections? Because democracy is a value that should be enforced, promoted, and supported everywhere, even in Mali. There is an emerging class of leaders, but they are unheard. They are suppressed by the bad leadership. Elections should be organized because it will help Malians to identify, I'll actually answer to the question, what should we do next? Before the elections, is hold a national sovereign conference, as we did in 1991, to bring Malians, the Keltamasheks, from all board and craft a delicate integration plan for the Keltamasheks into Mali, as it has been done before, but on wrong premises. So it is time that we address this in a global point of view instead of just pointing out to Tamashek or Arab, because it is impractical to have a Tamashek state, given that the territory, there is no single region in Mali where Tamasheks are over 26%, be it Kidal, Timbuktu, or Gao. So my question to you, what do we do today in the light of what I said in building the national conference, a sovereign national conference, then identify the way to go forward to the next elections? Now, how do we do to build that cohort of leaders that you talk about? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we take that round and then go another round. So begin with Malik's questions on Libya and Niger, and anyone who wants to take them on.
If I could try to maybe address all of the issues comprehensively, starting, if you don't mind, with the mayor from Mali, because I'm entirely in support of what your objectives are. In fact, I'm in favor of elections. The question is when. And tied to that challenge that we're confronting is really the observations that were made by Mr. Atala. If indeed what we have is convergence of interests between people in the north and people in the southern military establishment that are engaged in contraband, whether it's narcotics or cigarettes or fuel, then what we have is a very important economic linkage that will stand in the way of creating a civilian government. So then this is where the political economy of the reconstruction of the Malian state then becomes the next challenge. Because if there is an incentive for southern military officers and northern rebels to remain linked because of that contraband issue, we will have to overcome that in order for civilian leaders like yourself to come to the fore and then reconstitute the Malian state. If that's the case, then our challenge is considerably more complex than what I thought it would be at the beginning of this 2-hour conversation. Now, this conversation then has value because we've now re-articulated a particular challenge, the political economy that underlies the future reconstitution of the Malian state. Going to your question about Niger, Niger has been advantaged until the present moment because there is not the degree of animosity in Niger between the Tuareg peoples and the other ethnic groups within Mali. And furthermore, the new president of Mali specifically designated, of Niger, specifically designated as his Minister of Defense someone from the Tuareg community, which then provided for rapprochement, rapprochement between the two communities. So there's a different set of politics operating and a different history with regard to the degree of animosity between those in power in Niamey and those residing elsewhere in the country who may belong to the Tuareg community. That is not exportable to Mali because of Mali's different history, and now, as we understand, because of the different political economy that underlies the Malian state. So then, getting back to what you asked, what is it that we need to do? I said, and I want to re-emphasize this, because I've been saying this for about 2 years, we first have to recognize that this is a regional question that has to be addressed regionally. It is a question that does not engage the deployment of U.S. troops because of the blowback that is involved with insurgency. But it does involve a level of intelligent engagement using the resources that are appropriate to the resolution of the problem, which is the provision of our formidable intelligence gathering services, the provision of wise investments to the reconstitution of the Malian civil, or not just Malian, Nigerian, Libyan civil society, and the eventual subordination of military officers or militias to a central army. Those are the objectives that we need to engage only if we do agree, and I think we should agree, that there is an emerging crisis that is taking place in the Sahel.
There is a crisis for sure. I would point out to you that into the early 2000s, there was a Tuareg insurgency in Niger, and it was Brother Leader who, in fact, brokered the deal that led to the end of that insurgency. And my question remains, what can we do to help immunize Niger? Because the danger here, in my humble opinion, is that the insanity that is reigning in that sub-region, the last thing we want to see is for it to come across the border and infect the Nigerian body politic.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just for immunize Niger, first is interrelated to what's happening in Mali, and we go to intercommunal tensions. Is that what happens to Tuaregs, obviously, in northern Mali, especially if they exact revenge on them, there's going to have repercussions elsewhere. So that's extremely crucial. That's number one. Number two, it's true Niger has done a better job in addressing its Tuareg problem, though more in terms of co-optation than in addressing the real grievances. Up to now, the Tuaregs, obviously, they don't feel that they have benefited from the resources coming from uranium. That hasn't been addressed up to this day. So even there is discontent that must be addressed. You can't just rely on co-opting and appointing a prime minister, which is crucial, obviously, but that's not enough. So even there is simmering discontent. Niger has benefited from external aid. I mean, we know right now the United States and Europe, I mean, that's the zone of protection, Mauritania and Niger. And there is a huge emphasis on them to rebuild their security forces and in terms of financial aid. So that more of that obviously needs to be done. We go back to what I said, unwilling but incapable. The Nigerian more or less have been willing but incapable. So that's why the Europeans and the Americans, they have concentrated on Niger and on Mauritania. And I'll leave it here to go to.
Yeah, and one other dimension I'd add also amongst the Tuareg, there's a chief complaint that from the uranium mines, the dust is getting into the waterways, and it's a lot of kids are affected by their own kids. So heavy grievances there, but you're spot on. In terms of why do we care in the region, I mean that's a great question, and the obvious. I spent a lot of time on the counterterrorism side thinking of, but from a region, if we allow this, and I like to call it a cancer to fester, it's going to metastasize and continue to metastasize. We're seeing growth in the energy sector, so oil and gas. You're always finding new fields. Ghana is a great example of the oil industry just keeps booming. There are other places around West Africa. In the Sahel region, there's potential for oil gas up in certain quadrants between the borders of Mali, Niger, and Mauritania. So you've got companies, Western companies, that are out looking for this. Exxon Mobil, Statoil, BP, Diamond Offshore. All these companies are out there. So you've got Westerners operating in the region, and if you start seeing attacks like the one we saw in Algeria, that's going to cause some impact economically. You're going to see that. The other thing is and I always use France as an example. From a threat base, you have 10% of the French population is of some percentage North African, whether it's first, second, third, or fourth generation. You have individuals from within these groups that are sympathetic to the AQIM cause or the Islamist cause in the region. If you keep this unchecked, what you're going to have is a migration flow, potential attacks in Europe. People with dual citizenship, so whether it's they're carrying a French passport or whatever passport. So you've got to look at this in a holistic way. Also, if we continue to allow this black market to fester, that's going to continue. I mean, a good chunk of cocaine now going into Europe is coming through the Sahel plains, and it keeps growing and growing. So there are multiple factors. We can go on, but we have to look at this holistically. The other thing is, I always use the balloon theories. We've done a wonderful job at going after core al-Qaeda leadership in the AFPAC region, and we've done a great job. And some of the old guard we've ticked off one by one, and we've taken them out. There's a new generation, and this is not like a central command, but when you squeeze that balloon, it's going to come out the path of least resistance. In jihadi form, I think back in April of last year, there was an interesting map that came out. It was all of West Africa, North Africa, and then the map of Mali in the middle, which was all black with Allahu Akbar and these great big black arrows going up into northern Africa, into Nigeria, across the Sahel plain. there's a plan out there that they want to destabilize and control this region, kind of make Mali as a beachhead to expand in the region, and that's going to have all kinds of consequences that we need to pay attention to. So just putting it in a bigger picture, you know, it is important, and we can't let it go. Go ahead.
I would, if you would also respond, if you're able or willing, on the question, because it comes up very frequently on U.S. training, Captain Sinogo, what happened with the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership and all
Sure.
that.
In a simple way, after the 32 European tourists were kidnapped by El Para, or Le Para in French, and Abu Zaid was his lieutenant, and they came across the border into Mali, and what you have is the Algerians negotiating, this is circa 2003, Algerians negotiate, 17 of the 32 hostages were released. Then we go into a time of negotiations, and then the hostages were released for a sum of, I think, 5 million euros. So then there was a push to chase El Para across the desert. So we worked on a program called the Pan-Sahel Initiative, and it was successful because we did very little in terms of working with Mali, with Niger, with Chad, just to kind of give them, you know, a little bit of intelligence in the comms and whatnot, and so they were able to chase El Para across the Sahara, where he was finally captured by the, you know, in northern Chad. The MDJT played a role. Having said that, then what we have is things were happening, you know, circa 2004, 2005. There was discussions on, you know, counterterrorism programs. The East Africa Counterterrorism Initiative, EACTI, was expanding in the Horn of Africa, and so folks were going, hey, Pan-Sahel Initiative worked very well over here, and we're doing now some programs in the Horn. Why can't we do something a little bit more robust? And that's the genesis that got us into the OEFTS and TSCTP, okay? The Operation Enduring Freedom Trans-Sahel and the Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Program. So as we started looking at this, the United States was looking at this holistically, and OEFTS TSCTP now covers 11 countries, unless that changed. I'm not sure. We got some military folks here and it's about 11 countries. Okay, so the program was actually to get these countries to try to tackle the threat that was potentially going to grow or was growing in the region. We did a lot of training. Mali was a recipient of this training. However, we had to start off with the basics and then kind of build from there. And it was an integration of trying to get Mali to work regionally. Now, we were looking ahead, and we were taking a forward step in this. There's no military in the world, no matter what training, you can't stop people from doing whatever they want to do in their sovereign country. So it's not a mistake that the United States made. We were moving in a positive direction from the DoD standpoint. What Sinogo does is what Sinogo does. People are people. And I don't think there should be any responsibility pointing the finger at the U.S. military for you know, having done anything wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. We were actually doing something very positive in the region. We just need to continue from here. And I think the current crisis highlights that we need to expand that to a certain level to get it to a place where at least the host countries can handle things properly. Because when you look for a successful coin in the long term, you want to be able to finally walk away from a country and allow it to handle its own issues and the threats that may potentially come back into it.
If I can add, there were a lot of good reasons for the coup from a soldier's perspective. I'm not a military analyst, I'm a political scientist. But as I told you anecdotally in my emails with someone who had fought at Kona, that machine gun was not very well stabilized on his pickup truck, and he had to retreat. And not being a military analyst, and while applauding what the United States tried to do in terms of training folks in Mali and Niger and elsewhere, when you just do a cursory examination of the equipment that was available to the Malian army, and I didn't have a chance to look at rifles or machine guns, but I just took a look, you know, online of what they have in terms of aircraft. Didn't have any helicopters. None. I think they had 2 or 3 fighter jets, all about 30 years old. They were MiGs. They had maybe 6 or 7 airlift capabilities with fixed-wing aircraft. Again, there were Ilyushins that were 35 years old, right? So, you know, from Sonongo's perspective, I have a reason to have a coup. You're sending me out there in the army. I don't have adequate equipment. You're putting me in the position of being responsible for dealing with this insurgency, and I'm not adequately, you know, being provisioned. You know, so although we engaged in the Trans-Saharan counterterrorism program, you know, we did the best what we could. We tried to teach them how to shoot. We tried to teach them how to engage in reconnaissance. We tried to teach them movement. When you really look at whether they were well provisioned to function as an army, which is a more fundamental question, we didn't engage that question. They weren't. Which then, I hate to say this, provokes a more serious analysis of whether the money that we invested in the Trans-Saharan counterterrorism program was well invested when you haven't addressed the fundamental questions of the provisioning of the army.
Actually, if I may,
Yeah.
I would say probably if I had to pin it down to one point of failure where I think we could have done better is when we addressed the Mali military, and you know, and I use this as a loose example, say, do you want counterterrorism training? The answer is yes. Do you want to go and stop Al-Qaeda? Absolutely yes. But we never followed up with the most important question is, what is your definition of Al-Qaeda? What is your definition of the threat? Because I think what we would have discovered very quickly is it's those Tuareg up north, it's those guys that are ethnically different that keep creating these rebellions. And I think this is where I think we should have dug a little bit deeper in and just go, well, time out. You know, those are your own people within your own borders. And because what you see is in 2006 going forward, the Mali military has never engaged directly with the guys coming across the border. They've always allowed that to fester in the north. The Tuareg themselves engaged 3 times against GSPC and took some heavy losses. And so again, it begs the question of, you know, why did we miss that? But, you know, lessons learned moving forward, I think.
Yeah.
I have to apologize to the audience because of our collaboration with our television partners. We're running down to the wire here, so I think we have room for one more question, and it's Marina, who's up there. Right there. You.
Thank you. Marina Ottaway with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Rudolph, I'd like to push you a little more on this last point, please. Because it seems to me that listening to you about what we should do, and I'm not saying that you are wrong. I'm not advocating putting boots on the ground. I'm not advocating a heavy footprint or anything of the sort. But what I hear essentially is we have to continue doing what we have been trying to do with the Trans-Sahel initiative, with all these alphabet soup of previous initiatives that I can never keep straight in my mind, and so on and so forth. We have always thought about that issue regionally. It has never been, we never looked at the issue as sort of the separate problems in separate countries and so on. And what we see from the outcome, and I'm not pointing fingers, let me stand up so that I can see you, is that the results have not been particularly good. You know, the country is bleeding, and the French put a tourniquet on for the time being by intervening militarily, but the country is still bleeding. So why should we expect that more of the same would make a difference? Or how do we need to change what we have been doing more to the point so that this time is more effective? Because I'm not sure that I have heard anything very different in what you are suggesting.
So I have only a couple seconds. The bottom line, excellent question. I think it's not just advocating of, I think we need to do is look at the program and see where it failed and where it actually did very well, and try to address, you know, those points of failures and try to fix it. But I think we just can't divorce it. We can't walk away from it and say, well, it completely failed, so we're not going to do anything. So we have to look at it again holistically, and then try to make it better. That just from going forward, and we can talk offline over what those things can be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rudy, for that, and thank you for joining us. And please join me in thanking our panelists today.